Criminologist Professor Nirmala Gopal joins me now to talk more about the role that communities play in the fight against crime. Prof. Gopal, good morning. Thank you as always for being available to us. We appreciate your time. Listening to the ward councillor there, and we watched this story develop live on air with our reporter who was in Orlando yesterday, where members of the community confronted someone in a vehicle. They were almost looking like there were attempts to remove him from that vehicle. Somebody had brought a shambok along, and it looked again like there was going to be quite a violent confrontation. Later, as the minutes and sort of the hour passed, somebody else in one of the gatherings, they appeared with a tyre. So it looked like, had community leadership not been in play, had the police not arrived timeously, the situation may have gone awry. And this really gave us some insight and a window into the world of vigilantism, but also where the line is so fine between the community taking the lead. You know, they were expressing that they were concerned that police hadn't been following up on some of their leads and leaving basically the legwork to them to do, and where it then tips over into the potential for violence. Share with us maybe just from an academic perspective as well, what you've seen in how a situation can change before we unpack some of the other issues.
Good morning, Iman, and good morning to your viewers. And of course, I want to start by expressing my condolences to Amantle's family. So it's very interesting, I think, the question in terms of the fine line between community policing and vigilantism. So in the one instance, as far as community policing is concerned, we know and we understand that it's one of the pillars that South African police actually employs so that communities get involved in terms of proactive policing in South Africa. And I think, for as long as it is employed procedurally, constitutionally, it's a very powerful tool to use in terms of, pointing out suspects, proactively stopping crime. So it's a form of intelligence, I think, that the community brings to the table. And of course, it encourages citizens to be actively participating in maintaining public safety. Now, the fine line between that and vigilantism, as you rightfully point out, and the fact that this particular situation could have turned ugly, violent, unconstitutional, etc., is when citizens, communities take the law into their own hands and start engaging in violent behavior. So when we look at, a closer look at vigilantism, there's no procedure that's actually followed. It's unconstitutional by its very nature. So what we in South Africa encourage is community policing rather than vigilantism, or, policing that actually incorporates the elements of lawlessness. Yeah. Because that's exactly what there's no legitimacy in terms of vigilantism.
So let's break down some of those things, Prof. Gopal, because I think we have such an amazing opportunity in this moment to share with a number of our viewers who join us from communities all across the country who are facing this conundrum of how do we work with police and how do we do it in a way where we're not putting ourselves and the potential for breaking the law at risk. What are the limits? So if the community is saying, we're pointing out this person, we have intelligence, we know they're friends with the suspect, as is the case yesterday. This person potentially knows where the suspect is, a wanted person that police are looking for. What are the precepts? How can they maneuver? When do they risk crossing that fine line?
I'm going to start with your last question. When do they risk crossing the fine line? And that is when they become illegal in their activities and unlawful. For example, arresting the suspect using unreasonable force, for example, or engaging in extremely violent behavior that would be completely outside of the legal framework that allows citizens even to make an arrest. Of course, we know that we can do citizen arrest, but there's a particular framework that's very clearly spelled out in the Criminal Procedure Act. So what I think can happen is, for example, if they spot someone that they believe is a suspect, is to immediately get hold of the police. And what is important then for community policing to be effective is for strong, trusting, reliable relationship to exist between the police and the community. The community must trust the police, know that they will be available, especially in cases like this, where there was a sexual violence in addition to a murder. We know that these are high-profile crimes, and we need high-profile in the sense that it's a vulnerable category, where the victim belonged to a vulnerable category, and we need justice to be quick and immediate, especially in terms of arresting the criminal. So that close relationship between police and community is extremely important. But I want to take that a little step further by saying to us that what is really critical, I think, in terms of making community arrests or the community being involved is educating our community, empowering our community in terms of the legal framework that's necessary to make those arrests or to provide support to the law enforcement agencies.
Nirmala, I'll give you a moment. I think your phone's ringing there, to just put it on silent while I phrase the next question. Don't worry, you're off camera, so you can do that.
Sorry.
No problem at all. We know you're a busy person, in demand as well. It's this education and empowering piece that I'm really keen on us talking a little bit more about, because as you've said, and in fact, as we saw yesterday, it was really quite amazing to watch the community say, hey, we know that you guys hang out with this group of people, so you're all connected. They knew exactly who to go to. They know the relationship networks in the community. So it was really, really interesting to see almost in real time those networks being, kind of brought to light. And then we saw the police involvement. We also saw the ward councillor, and it looked like some community activists as well, who were providing that buffer between some members of the community who were really, really angry, almost seeming as if they might cross that thin line, but they sort of stood in the fray right there in the front line. So just share with us then how people who might find themselves unexpectedly having to lead something or take a leadership role when the situation is so volatile, what can they do to empower themselves to handle it in a way that, has a positive outcome?
So, yeah, of course, South Africa, unfortunately, we're very volatile in terms of crime and violence, etc. So sometimes it's not so easy to stop and think and, think about the legal framework or the procedural way in which we actually make these arrests or, want to protect a society. But I think very importantly is, we have the community policing forums, and perhaps that's an excellent forum through which our law enforcement agency together with communities can start that empowerment exercise. And I think perhaps also if we can identify not just ward councillors but other informal community leaders who will take on these leadership roles in these particular circumstances, we need to empower them. But I think importantly is to identify as many leaders as possible, but very importantly to make sure that we empower them to work within the constraints of the law and within the legal frameworks.
Can community members restrict someone's movement? Sometimes there's a fear, someone might run away or they might get into a car and drive off. What does the law say?
So I think in terms of that, usually what we would look at is restricting or restraining their movement using reasonable force. But of course, we must have reasonable suspicion that the person has actually committed a crime. And you can use reasonable force then to restrain that particular individual. But most importantly, empowering in terms of what the law allows and what the law does not allow, because that's where we can get into trouble. And then they will, those individuals who have actually restricted outside of the legal framework will actually get into trouble with the law. And we don't want that.
I really want to go back also to building the networks and the bridges of trust between all of the stakeholders, from police station level all the way to somebody just living in any street in a community across the country. It has been anomalous in some. It doesn't happen as common cause, and we know that there are in certain places, heightened levels of distrust between the police and the community. In fact, some of the sentiments we heard expressed yesterday is, why is it taking the police so long to get here? On the other hand, we heard from police officials, Professor Gopal, that they have been responsive. They had a community meeting on Monday in the aftermath of this case. We've seen them on the ground over the last couple of days being visible. So how do we ensure that these bonds become tighter? What would you like to see? And maybe you can share some success stories in places where there was that trust deficit that was healed, that resulted in better policing outcomes and a safety experience for communities.
So I think, what is, I think, very important, maybe first to note that unfortunately in South Africa, 30 some odd years into democracy, we've allowed the situation to degenerate to such an extent that it's almost so difficult to rebuild that trust between police or law enforcement agencies and communities. However, in terms of success stories, one sector of policing, I think, that does extremely well is public order policing. And they seem to have quite an interesting framework. Well, I'm not sure if it's a formal or informal framework, but they have quite an interesting framework that they employ where they start to, they build trust. They have built trust with communities, showing communities that they are there, not necessarily to, become violent, etc. So maybe it's that kind of model that we need to tap into so that we can, disseminate those kind of skills and value system to perhaps visible policing. At this point in time, I'm not sure what model visible policing actually incorporates, but perhaps to exchange good practices and use some benchmarks between the different sectors within the law enforcement themselves.
Yeah. It was also so interesting today, and we heard a number of things from, the police officials, the provincial police commissioner, for example, in Gauteng, talking about a range of crime prevention and activation programs here in the province, but also said, and kind of turned it back to community involvement, saying that those who are also harboring, is the term that he used, illegals in the country could face charges themselves. We know that there is a case against the landlord in this particular case that now has been opened as well. That's also what we heard from police earlier. Is, sometimes there could be that level of oblivion around what community members are responsible for, what they could be criminally liable for, and also, what their role should be in making sure that they keep their eyes and ears open. So perhaps just share with us that as well, Nirmala, just your thoughts on that, and people also knowing exactly what the law requires of them in terms of their rights and responsibilities.
So, Iman, I will revisit one of my earlier suggestions, citizen education. I think in South Africa, we don't invest adequately in citizen education. And this is one of the areas, safety, public safety is an area that we absolutely need to invest in. And a curriculum that's designed to speak to the community members.
Yeah.
So I'm not sure that we have one that's effective at the moment. And use the community policing forums for these kind of initiatives, because as we know, research has shown us that many of our community policing forums are quite dysfunctional, or members in those
Professor Nirmala Gopal, thank you very much for talking to us today. I'm so sorry we had to leave it there, but we do appreciate your time.